Hello, everybody, and thanks for showing up today. This is my first time ever doing a virtual talk, so it's a little different. So bear with me. Um, as Maya clearly stated, I've been documenting movie theaters across Southeast Asia for about 12 years now. Those last years been a hiatus year for obvious reasons. And when I say across Southeast Asia, I haven't explored the entire region, mostly limited to Thailand, Burma, or it's also known as Myanmar and Laos. So spent basically 12 years, the first maybe 4 of them very intensely traveling and looking for movie theaters. My inspiration came very kind of haphazardly as a graduate student at Chiang Mai University, where I was getting a degree in sustainable development from back in 2007. I one day stumbled across an old standalone movie theater that I did not know existed, right in the heart of the city of Chiang Mai, and that was the beginning of this love affair. I found this theater and I said to myself, why, by golly, I'm going to go check out a movie here, because it was something I was already doing in the multiplex theaters on the regular in my downtime from school. So I decided to do that. However, I was a little bit late, waited about 4 months, and by the time I went back, the theater was demolished. And that act of destruction was the genesis of this project. It kind of dawned on me then and there that if this is what's happening to the old cinema in Chiang Mai, maybe it's happening elsewhere in the country. And I decided to explore that question, and boy, did I go down a rabbit hole, which I arguably haven't come out of yet. So that's the basic foundation of it. I turned it into my graduate thesis. This project went from strictly documentary through photograph to archiving stories and local histories of movie theaters throughout the region. And eventually it turned into a book, which was just published a couple of years ago, called Thailand's Movie Theaters, Relics, Ruins, and the Romance of Escape. And that's where I've kind of left off. So today I'm going to talk basically about movie theaters in Thailand and my experience documenting them, and kind of give you a bit of an abridged history and throw some other things in as well. So let's begin. When did cinema become a thing? In like 1897, the Lumiere brothers, if I'm not mistaken. And shortly after that, cinema was exhibited. Actually, agents of the Lumiere brothers were sent across Southeast Asia and East Asia, bringing with them this great new technology. And they were screening it at various existing venues, some of them live theaters, some of them belonging to the princely and the kind of courts of the nobility, let's say. And these were kind of informal screening spaces. And this went on until 1905, when the first movie theater was built in Bangkok. That was known as the Japanese Theater. And it was called that because the builder and founder of it was a man of Japanese origin, who saw that Thailand had yet to have this medium, a formal space for it, and he constructed the first cinema, known as the Japanese cinema. And it was much like this photo that you're looking at. It was a wooden, almost barn-like affair, which was by and large the look of most of the early movie theaters in Thailand. Thailand, as you may or may not know, is was a largely forested country. and they had a lot of tropical hardwoods, which were perfect for building these kind of simple yet somewhat for their times luxurious movie theaters. And they could be found up and down the country. The previous one this one was, I'm not actually sure where this theater was. I believe I stole it from the internet. This one I think I also stole from the internet, but I know where this theater was and is actually. This is in southern Thailand in the city of Songkhla. Now the theater still exists. And yeah, they were very simple barn-like structures without many flourishes. If you were to go inside, you would see they had wooden seats. So not the most comfortable of things, but this is how people watched movies in the early 20th century. There's the same theater now. It still exists. It's been turned into a parking lot. A few years ago, there was a famous Thai artist brought his art project down to this city of Songkhla, where he basically creates movie-style billboard murals and posts them around the town. And the content of the murals is individuals and businesses and landmarks within the town. So for this theater, he used the facade to plaster this art project over, trying to kind of bring life to the local business community and highlight its history, and also draw people to this old building, which is still just sitting as a parking garage, sadly. One of these ancient movie theaters in existence in Bangkok, this is the Sala Chalerm Thani Theater, which was built in 1918, all wood, as you can see. It operated until 1993, then went out of business, and has sat as a warehouse for a number of years. However, a few years ago, there was a movement to restore it, and it has been restored. Or it's in the process of being restored anyhow. This photo is from probably 5 years ago before the restoration. I haven't seen it since then, so I don't have a before and after photo, but it is being restored and is one of the few cases in the region of cinema preservation. Yeah, I guess you can say the preservation of a historic standalone movie theater. So what you saw prior to the photo you're seeing now is basically the way the state of movie theaters in Thailand up until the late 1920s. And then in 1930, in preparation for the 150th anniversary of the founding of the Chakri dynasty in Thailand, which is the ruling monarchical dynasty, and the 150th anniversary of the founding of Bangkok, the then sovereign, King Prajadipok of Thailand, took from his royal budget some X 100,000 baht and designated it for the construction of a state-of-the-art world-class movie theater. And that was what you're looking at now. It's the Sala Chalerm Krum Theater, which translated roughly means the great theater of the city. And this was basically the first high standard movie theater in the country, and would change the scope and design of cinema construction in Thailand basically going forward. These were no longer just kind of rinky-dink wooden affairs. Cinema was now seen as a harbinger of modernity, and going to the movies, the pinnacle of entertainment. It was also the first public building in Thailand to include air conditioning in it. So that was quite a feat for the time. And yeah, this set the stage for things to come. When I visited the theater, which is still owned by the Crown Property Bureau, it's still owned by the royal family. They had no problems with me photographing the lobby and whatnot. This is what you're looking at now. But the absolutely gorgeous auditorium, they wouldn't let me take pictures of. And I've had trouble actually finding photos of them online. But it really is quite a spectacle. One of the few, what I would say, true movie palaces, and of the movie palace era that we think of, at least in the United States and parts of Europe, from the late 19 teens through the early 1930s. And this is one of the few in Asia that I've seen. So beloved were these cinemas that the tickets that they were used to sell looked like currency, and the architecture of the theaters was clearly shown on the tickets. These were spectacles. These were kind of showpieces for the communities that they served. They were showpieces for the people who owned them, which I think is, in many ways and in most cases, contrasts quite starkly with the modern multiplex. There was the new Odeon. The tickets looked like money. The Broadway Theater of Bangkok. These are all part of my collection. One of my many manias that I've picked up since I started documenting theaters is collecting old tickets. The Empire Theater, also of Bangkok. The Capitol Theater. This building is actually still in existence. It's a kind of notorious market, notorious for its bootleg wares and technologies that they sell. Hollywood, and so on and so on. This was a theater in Chiang Mai, Thailand, called the Suriwong, which no longer exists. But while I have this up here, this is a good tie-in, especially talking about the Salachalam Krung, the Royal Theater, which I just showed you previously. It's very interesting in Thailand how movie theaters, in this one included, tended to be the enterprises of very politically powerful people, from the royals themselves to kind of minor nobility, such as this one. The Suriwong Theater was built by a descendant of the last lords of Chiang Mai. Other theaters were built by people who would go on to play important roles in Thai politics, from prime ministers, like for instance, the Shinawat family, who was a prime ministers up until 2014. Their family made their fortune in cinemas in Chiang Mai, which they then rolled into other professions and eventually into the role of prime minister. So in Thailand, to own cinemas was very much, besides being a lucrative enterprise, it was also, I would say in some ways, a political enterprise. You're controlling what people see. You're controlling kind of narratives that come through film. And if you look at this in the context of various epochs, like the Cold War, and the cinemas that were being shown during the Cold War, well, you've got things. Thailand was aligned with the West, and you were getting lots of movies from Hollywood, and with the very specific messages that they were showing at the time, they were conveying at the time. So that's that. They are political spaces as much as they are social and event spaces in Thailand. Having said that, this theater, the Army Theater, well, it was built in the city of Lopburi, which has the largest army base, and it was built by the then fascist-leaning Prime Minister of Thailand, Pibun Songkram, who had during World War II aligned himself with the Axis and was using Albert Speer-inspired architecture to build a number of theaters in Thailand and to show propaganda films. I believe the debut movie that screened at this theater was called Blood of the Thai Soldiers, or Blood of the Thai Army, and it was produced by that administration. This one is the Salachalam Thani, another theater that was also built by the same administration. So this is World War II. Besides the state-built theaters like this and the previous, there wasn't much movie theater development going on during World War II. I think that's safe to say for most of the world. Resources were being spent on the war effort and everything that accompanied that. By the end of the war, the economy is starting to grow. People have their hopes up in they're hopeful of a new future. Then the state leads the way again with another movie theater. This was the Salachalam Thai, which for many years was the kind of the grandest movie theater in the country. It was right on the Grand Boulevard, the Ratchadamnern Boulevard in the center of Bangkok, where all the political and cultural institutes were located. It was at the head of this road, and it kind of symbolized Thailand's, again, a movie theater symbolizing Thailand's progress into the next stage of development. And this led the way for a whole rash of developments that came afterwards in the 1950s, again, often on royal lands or the lands of minor nobility. This theater, the Queen's Theater, was built on a property that once held a palace, a royal palace. In fact, there was 3 movie theaters clustered together where this one was located. And there were the King's, the Queen's, and the Grand. And this is it, sorry, I should mention, this is in central Bangkok. And in the 1950s, this area was the epicenter of youth culture, and it was due to these theaters. So, yeah, there's the Grand, Queen, Grand, and I guess I don't have a picture of the King, but you get the idea. These kind of great mid-century modern movie theaters. This is obviously not a movie theater, but is the Thai poster for the film The Ugly American, which had its world premiere in Thailand at the Salachalam Thani Theater, or sorry, the Salachalam Thai Theater, which I showed you a few pictures prior. It was filmed all in Thailand, and if you haven't seen it, it's a great depiction of Cold War tensions in Southeast Asia. And what's interesting about the poster itself, I think, is that Marlon Brando is the lead character in the film, the protagonist. However, the then acting Prime Minister of Thailand, I think the film was made in 1961, the Prime Minister Kukrit Pramot, had a minor role in the film. He played the King of Thailand. And because of his important place in Thai society, he is given a physically higher billing than Marlon Brando in the poster. So there you have it. Theaters flourished specifically and particularly in towns which were close to military bases in the Vietnam War era. During, I believe in 1961, the Royal Thai Air Force and the United States Air Force struck a deal to allow the US to station planes on these Thai air bases for various reconnaissance and bombing missions over Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. These cities had booming wartime economies, and movie theaters developed all around them. And the reason I show this picture is I got this from a US serviceman who was stationed in Ubon Ratchathani, and decided to take a picture of himself in front of one of the local movie theaters. Oh, and that's right, there's a style progression. So here's the movie theater circa 1961. This is the Chalom Sin Theater of Ubon Ratchathani. And you can see its original architecture kind of on the border between Art Deco and some, more classical style, I guess. I believe this theater was built in the early 1950s. As you get more into the mid-century modern style of architecture, which followed in the brutalism, this theater became modified over the years. And here's what it looked like in the mid-1960s when The Way West was screening. So you can kind of see this architectural transition, these modifications based on, trying to keep current. Here's another vintage photo of a theater, a random theater in northern Thailand. It's great mid-century modern style. So in general, I guess I'm skipping a big part. In general, from 1961 onwards, this corresponds with the era of high American influence in Thailand. Thailand is a client state of the United States in the Cold War. It's receiving billions of dollars worth of economic aid, military aid. Rapid rural development programs are initiated in order to try and fend off the growth of communism. And much of this translates into the construction of roads and highways, which are going through areas which were previously somewhat inaccessible. So with roads comes commerce, and with commerce comes a growing economy, and movie theaters flourished during this period. In 1961, across the country, you find, it's funny, you find 61 as the year. When I would talk to people in the field, I'd ask them what year the theater was built, and it seems like they never went older than 1961. And yeah, that just happened to correspond with this alliance between the US and Thailand at the time. So, and this construction period, this movie theater boom, as I call it, goes until 1981, and then there's a bit of a lull, and then there's a transformation, which we'll get into later. Some of them are very simple affairs, like this one, just big blocks. This was in the city of Pitsanulok, which is in central Thailand. Yeah, same architect. This is a vintage photo of a theater in Pitsanulok. This is a photo that I took of a similar theater in a town about 100 or so kilometers away. I was always fascinated by this look. It's very kind of brutalist, I guess. And in doing my research, I discovered that it was the same owner who was employing the same architect in both cases. You can see actually the font on the name above the marquee is almost exactly the same. Then in 1966, another revolution in Thai movie theaters comes about. In Bangkok, you get the construction of the Siam Theater. The Siam becomes the kind of great leap forward in movie theater development in the post-war era. The Siam was the first movie theater to utilize Cinerama technology. It was also the first building, or the first movie theater, I'm sorry, I take this back, not the first building, but the first movie theater to have an escalator in it. And you can see that in this picture there over on the left. But it kind of set the standard for modern architecture, modern movie theater architecture in Thailand. And along with its sister theater, Lido, which was built right next door. Yeah, it started off a new wave of theater construction. From here on out, movie theaters wanted to emulate the Siam Theater because it was the grandest and most luxurious, and because it was of its use of Cinerama technology. So from here on out, you get movie theaters across Thailand using Rama in their title. And when I first started doing this research and I was coming across theaters that had the name Rama in it, I thought it had something to do with Buddhist ecclesiastical lore, but it doesn't at all. Rama is also the term for sovereigns in Thailand, the term for kings. So there's Rama the First, Rama the Second. But in fact, the Rama use in movie theaters comes from the technology of Cinerama. And even movie theaters that did not employ Cinerama, in order to appear that they were the most modern and up-to-date type of movie theater around, they changed their name to something Rama. So if you were in the city of Lopburi, you might be the Lopburi Rama, or if you were in Chiang Mai, you'd have the Chiang Mai Rama. Some of them did in fact use Cinerama, some not. In this case, the Pet Rama, which was one of the grand movie theaters in Bangkok, I'm pretty sure they did use it because they have the actual Cinerama logo on the facade. So 1961 is the boom year basically in movie theaters in Thailand, and it proliferates from there on out. Through the 1960s, towns and villages across the country which never had access to cinemas are now getting them. And so you have new markets of moviegoers. Often they are pre-literate or lowly educated agronomists, farmers, people upcountry who have, very little education. So in order to appeal to this market, Thailand develops a very, very, very interesting film poster production industry. And I haven't seen many kinds of it, many other examples of national movie posters that are quite like Thai movie posters. They were very visceral. They have an emphasis on violence and sex, and they also just very detailed. You can see the entire plot of a movie by looking at these movie posters, which started to go into production in the 1960s. And in my talking to people throughout Southeast Asia, this was basically a way to market to a pre-literate population, to this new market of moviegoers who would not necessarily respond well to a sort of abstract design like what was happening in much of the West at the time with movie poster design. Thailand goes in the opposite direction and everything becomes extremely explicit. So this is what transpired at the time. Moving right along. Again, these are just some of my shots. This was the Mahachai Rama in the city of Mahachai. What struck me about this theater and this picture of it was its situation within the town itself. Mahachai is kind of a satellite city to Bangkok, not too far from a coastal area. It's got a very big fishing industry. It's not a very big town, but the downtown core is extremely dense and very busy. When I reached the town, as when I reach any town, I instantly set out looking for movie theaters and I ask around, and over time I became so adroit and adept at finding the movie theaters without asking anybody. I just knew exactly where to look, and sure enough, I would find it. But in the city of Mahachai, it was so glaringly easy to find. The theater is literally right in the center. if you look at the city, the town plan, it's got a few grid rows of streets, which correspond to the market area. And this is literally right in the center. So it at once shows the importance of movie theaters, the importance of movie going to a town, their relationship to the city. There are a number of Thai cities in which the movie theater or the movie theater was the central focus of the town. Again, this is just more of my shots. These theaters don't necessarily have any unique individual stories themselves, but just an idea of what they were like. This one, it was in the city of Sakeo. In contrast to the last one, which was right in the heart of town, the Sakeo Rama, see, Rama again. I know they weren't using Cinerama technology in this theater, but this was what I would call an edge city type theater. So there were some towns in which the theater was right in the heart, like the previous photo. But then another development type you would get would be the development of theater on the edge of the city, corresponding often with a new transportation infrastructure. So once the city was connected by a new national grade road, then you would have a bus station put nearby, and around this bus station would be clustered a number of commercial enterprises, usually a new market. The old markets are right in the center of the city, often near the train station. The new markets pop up near the bus stations on the outskirts of the city. This is in the 1970s and 80s. And the Sakeo Rama is a perfect example of that. It was literally built with the bus station. And I don't have a photo of it, but kind of from the perspective of where I was taking this photo, behind where I was this giant plaza of what were now abandoned shop houses. The concept and the idea at the time was that now everyone's going to be driving everywhere. Everyone's going to get a car, and no one's going to be able to crowd into the town centers to go to the movies. They're going to drive a little bit outside of town into these edge city complexes. It's kind of like the forerunner to the multiplex and the strip mall, which is what we have in the US, and I'm sure in many other places. Yeah, here's another example. This was the Seonsuk Cinema in what city was this in? It's in Udon Thani province. I can't remember the name of the city. Gumpawapi, a very small city which has an ancient monument in it, Khmer era monument. Anyhow, again, this was the look and gauge of standalone movie theaters in Thailand, especially in upcountry towns. They were literally standing alone. They weren't often clustered as parts of row or shop houses. They were standalone. This was one out in the outskirts of Bangkok, the Bangkhae Rama. The name of the area was Bangkhae. Again, they're using the term Rama. When I visited it in 2015, it was still in business. Most of these theaters I visited were long gone, and what I was left with was ruins. But a few were in business. Some were still showing contemporary films. A number of them in Bangkok had become porn theaters and kind of illicit dens, and this was one of them. And I learned over the years that you could always tell one of these theaters that was showing illicit things, or there was some sort of extra cinema activity going on. They would all say on the marquee, "Showing today 4 movies in a row, nonstop." That was key to know that there was something else going on. So anyhow, I saw that sign here on this Bangkhae Rama theater, and I set up my camera to take a picture of it. And almost immediately, the manager comes running out and he's waving, no, 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 you can't take a photo here. No way. And I explained to him that, look, I'm not interested in what's going on in the theater. I get it. I know you've got something going on. I'm just documenting theater architecture. And after, a fairly in-depth conversation, which I proved to him that this is actually my motive, he allowed me to set up and take pictures. And voila, here we have it. And what I didn't realize until after I had gotten home, in this particular photograph, if you look down in the lower left of the theater, you can see a man there kind of on the ground level. And he is in the midst of a running stride. And I guess I didn't notice him when I was taking the picture, but clearly he was running out of the theater and didn't want to be documented for whatever he was doing in there at the time. So there's that. The Bangsapanoi Theater. Here's another one, again with a similar story to the rest of Thailand's theaters. This is in a little tiny town in southern Thailand that gets very few visitors. I show up to the town, track down the theater. When a foreigner is snooping around little towns like this, taking pictures of forgotten architecture, tends to draw attention. So within about an hour of doing this, someone spotted me and struck up a conversation. And next thing you know, I'm getting introduced to basically the entire bureaucracy of the city, many of whom were the descendants of the owners of this theater. So again, movie theaters in Thailand, this was a kind of reaffirmation that the cinema is very much a political as well as an economic enterprise in the city in the towns and cities that they sprung up, which was all over the country. In this case, if I remember correctly, the story goes, it was a Chinese immigrant who moved to southern Thailand, started a coconut plantation, got very rich, diversified into all kinds of industries. Among them was the movie theater. And now his family, they're like the local magistrates, and they own everything. And they're the politicians as well. Kind of reminds me of a Western I once saw starring Anthony Quinn and Kirk Douglas called A Town Without Pity. I think that's what it's called, which Kirk Douglas shows up in this little town in the Wild West to avenge the murder of his wife. And he finds Anthony Quinn as like the local sheriff, and quickly discovers that not only is Anthony Quinn the local sheriff, but he owns absolutely everything and everybody in the town. That's kind of how I feel when that's what I've discovered when I go through Thailand into these little towns. The Siri Phnom Rama, this was a great example of late international style architecture on the cusp of brutalism in a little town called Siri Phnom, Phnom Salakam, sorry, in eastern Thailand. Again, as my research led me to find out, the owner of the theater is a member of parliament in Bangkok. I like to show these two back to back because they're kind of examples of, they're not quite brutalism. I once made the mistake of saying this is Thai brutalist cinema architecture, but I was quickly told otherwise. This is late stage international style. And apparently the difference is brutalism is obviously, as its name suggests, very brutal and heavy looking, and would not have thin legs, thin pillars holding up a larger structure. Everything tends to be on the ground and kind of hulking. Whereas the thinness of the support structures in the Bangpa in Rama theater, shown here, give it a kind of light, airy look. At least that's what a Thai architecture professor told me. So yes, I forgot to mention these last two theaters, the City Phnom Rama and the Bangpa In Rama, they were built in the 1980s, the very early 1980s. And they kind of represent the last gasp of the construction of standalone style movie theaters. After that, in I believe it was 1984 or 85, you get Thailand's first movie city, which was the Nevada multiplex out in Ubon Ratchathani. It was such an uninteresting structure and so hard to photograph because of its weird angles that I just took a picture of the sign. But that was the first multiplex theater in the country and set the stage for things to come. Yeah, now Thailand is dominated by multiplex movie theaters. I'm estimating there's somewhere in the vicinity of 600 to 700 screens in Thailand, active movie theater screens. And at the moment, 99.5% of them are in multiplexes, most of them in shopping malls. Thailand went from having a total population of standalone movie theaters of around 600 to 700 to 0, essentially. Maybe there's one or two that you might consider. It's of anywhere I've ever researched or any other, places that have had widespread cinema screenings, Thailand has gone completely 100% away from this model and to the more commercial multiplex model. There's a lot of reasons for that. It's fairly complex. The number one reason is Thailand is the land of monopoly capitalism, I guess you can say. All those multiplexes are controlled by two organizations, two companies. Basically, the little guy has been completely squeezed out. And so all these theaters you've seen pictures of are just sitting empty. A lot of them have been destroyed. There's very little movement to rehabilitate them in a few cases. So yeah, this is one of the few existing standalone movie theaters, independent ones. This is in some little town in the far northeast of the country. It's funny, a lot of the existing ones are, again, owned by individuals or families who have a lot of economic or political infrastructure in the towns the theaters are located in. And they've often been, it's multi-generational. So this theater, which is called the Det Udom Mini Theater, replaced an old wooden theater which stood in the same place, probably from the 1950s. When that got too shabby and run down, they tore it down and built this concrete replacement. And it is one of, there's two now, there's two independent theaters left. There's that one and this one, in also in the same area of the country. Chumpe, the Chumpe Cineplex. And I find the newer ones they're rather boring compared to the old ones. I would be talking about this one as a candidate for preservation, and I guess I still can to some degree. But since I made this PowerPoint, the Scala Theater, which was Thailand's last existing operational movie palace, has been mostly dismantled. Yeah, the Scala was indeed, it was really a great movie theater in the heart of Bangkok. It was built in 1969 by a guy who would go on to run the largest theater chain in the company. It was called Apex. It was originally called Pyramid and then Apex. They were movie distributors and theater builders. and to a lesser extent, movie producers. And the Scala was their crown jewel. It was the last operational movie palace in the country. This was the lobby. It had a beautiful vaulted ceiling with these bronze ceiling medallions and tapered columns. I don't know if you can see in the background there's this wall relief, beautiful work of art by a Filipino artist depicting various Asian civilizations kind of intertwined in this very playful modernist style. Because the Scala sits on very prime real estate, about 8 years ago, it's the landlord of the property, which is the biggest university in Thailand, Chulalongkorn University, announced that they were going to demolish this theater and build a shopping mall to increase revenue for the university. There was immediately a big backlash against that, and kind of an ad hoc preservation community sprung up. And over the years, they chipped away and got the university to come to its senses. And towards the end, it seemed as if the Scala was going to be preserved. Come 2020, the COVID pandemic, everything's on lockdown, theaters shut down in Bangkok and across Thailand. The owners of the Scala decide that they're going to shut down operations. And it seemed at this point that, okay, they're shutting down, but the university is now open to bids, has opened the bidding process for new operators to come and take over the theater, which would have been a fantastic development. And this was in the process of happening. While this bidding process was going on, the owner and steward of this theater for the last 50 years of its existence gets this idea that they are going to strip the entire theater of everything and move it down to another property they own a few hundred miles away, and kind of recreate the theater in a very campy, kishy kind of way, strictly for tourists. And that's what happened. It was a very tragic end to this saga. The preservation community in Bangkok at large, which had grown very, very fond of this landmark, lost out to a company which, in a family which I guess just had zero vision. I was kind of reminded when I saw that they were taking it apart piecemeal and bringing it down to their other property. I was kind of reminded of the stories of the pharaohs in ancient Egypt, when they would be buried with their wealth. I mean, this is a theater family which has been around for a long time, and they're all quite senior. And for them, instead of giving over this legacy to the city, which they could then stake some claim to, they decided to bring it with them. It just made me think of the pharaohs, bringing their wealth to their death. So right now you have this stripped down building in Bangkok. I don't have any photos of it, but it's completely bare. There's still some hope that it could possibly be resurrected and turned into a multi-function art and culture space, including cinema, with a primary function of cinema. But they've got a lot of hurdles to go through now, including a very large budget to bring it back up to its former ornate shape. So that's where my story ends for the time being. Here's some, I've included some photos of theaters in neighboring Burma, where they're having a very different experience, very, very different experience right now, which doesn't necessarily correspond to what's been happening with their theaters. As you may or may not be aware, Burma is suffering through yet another military coup, and that has brought great turmoil and tragedy to the country. And I almost feel silly talking about theaters in Burma when everything else is just in complete disarray. But Burma has beautiful standalone theaters that have endured because of its isolation over the years. Yeah, they've endured in very good shape for the last 50 years. They were on the decline when I first went to Burma to document them in 2010. They were still very old. Nothing had been updated. It was very hard to get new equipment because of all the sanctions against the country. And so what you had were these, aging theaters that looked the way Thai movie theaters looked in the early days. They often had wooden seats, and they were still using carbon arc projectors, and it was fascinating, actually. But yeah, that has changed, and Burma now has some of the last great standalone movie theaters in Southeast Asia. Modern movie palaces. There's one of them. There's one of my favorites. That's the Windlight Cinema in Mandalay. Built in 1958. Nice streamlined modern movie theater, 1,200 or something seats on the interior. Quite a spectacle. Burma is the last country in Southeast Asia that still has a few of these grand mid-century movie theaters. In Thailand with the Scala, that was one more, but that's gone now. So there's the most beautifully situated movie theater I've ever come across. That's in the city of Mogok in Upper Burma. Mogok is where the lion's share of the world's rubies supplies comes from. So it's a quite wealthy city. And this was one of their 2 movie theaters, which has been revived since I photographed it. This was 2 years ago. So yeah, that's my talk.